They said the mountain man was mad to send for a bride. He needed a strong, sensible woman to survive the high country. But when the train pulled in, and out stepped a woman larger than any they'd ever seen, jaws dropped. She wasn't what he expected, not by a mile. Yet, in the silence of snow-covered peaks, something stirred between two broken souls. Who was this woman, the town mocked? Why didn't he send her away? And how did she, of all people, come to heal a man who'd sworn off love forever? Folks still whisper about what happened next. When a mountain heart meets an unexpected soul, and the snow begins to thaw, one question lingers: what truly makes a person worthy of love? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories like this speak across distance and time. If you believe in redemption, quiet strength, and the power of second chances, then you're already part of our frontier family. Let me know which state you're watching from, and if you value these tales as much as we do, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep sharing stories that matter. The wind carried the scent of coal, smoke, and rust as the great iron train let out a final, aching whistle. Steam hissed and rolled across the platform like ghosts of every woman who had ever boarded in hope or fled in shame. Margaret Walker stood quietly amid it all, the hem of her brown wool skirt brushing against a worn carpet bag, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she clutched the letter that had changed her life. It was creased from reading, smudged with fingerprints and rain, but the words still burned in her chest like kindling to a dying flame. I am not a man of many words. I live alone. I need a wife who is not afraid of the quiet or the land. If you can work, and you are plain and kind, I'll provide for you. Yours in sincerity, Gideon Black, plain and kind. That's what she was told she was, once in the kinder corners of her life. Not pretty, never thin, but kind, surely, gentle, certainly, and hard-working, always. Yet, as the station platform bustled with travelers and townsfolk, laughter trailed behind her like ash in the wind. Two young boys stood elbowing each other behind a baggage cart, whispering loud enough for her to hear. "That can't be her," one said with a snort. He asked for a wife, not a barn. Their mother hushed them, but only half-heartedly. A pair of girls with bonnets too bright and eyes too cruel covered their mouths with gloved hands, giggling as they passed her by. Margaret kept her chin high, eyes low, as she stepped toward the edge of the platform. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles from Virginia to this nowhere town tucked at the edge of the world. Coldwater Gap, they called it, a name that stung with every syllable. She didn't expect welcome. She hadn't dreamed of roses or confetti, but she had hoped for something simple: a man with worn hands and honest eyes, a life with room for her in it. Yet no one stepped forward, no one approached the platform with her name on his lips. The letter had said March 3rd. He'd meet her by the station bench, the one near the water pump. But only dust stirred there now, and a stray dog sniffed at the cast-off sandwich paper of someone long gone. The town seemed to shrink away from her, as if uncertain what to do with such a woman too large, too plain, too present. But Margaret didn't cry. Not here, not where they could see. She straightened her shoulders, tucked the letter into her bodice, and lifted her carpet bag with both hands. The weight didn't bother her. She was used to carrying more than most. A woman with gray hair and eyes like cooled steel watched from the steps of the general store. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Margaret offered the faintest nod. Behind her, the train hissed once more and groaned to life, pulling away from the station and the world she'd left behind. There was no turning back, only forward into the mountains, into the silence, and into the unknown hands of a man who expected something else entirely. The sun had barely slipped behind the ridge line when Margaret stepped down from the platform and into the heart of Coldwater Gap. The town was nestled like a secret between two slopes, the kind of place where shadows came early and news traveled faster than trains. Storefronts leaned tired against the wind, their shutters clapping gently like gossiping tongues. A lantern flickered to life inside the saloon, casting long, amber fingers across the dusty street. Horses huffed and stamped in their hitching posts, and from the windows, eyes watched. Margaret moved with quiet determination, though every step felt heavier than the last. Her boots were caked with soot, and her dress bore the signs of long travel creases, stains, and the weight of every mile. Yet it wasn't the wear that drew attention. It was her size, her silence, her audacity, perhaps, to walk into a town like this looking the way she did. A boy whistled low and long from the mercantile steps. A woman snapped her fan shut and muttered to a friend beside her, who didn't bother to whisper when she said, "She'll break that poor man's roof in." Laughter, light and cruel, rippled from porch to porch. Margaret didn't meet their eyes. She focused instead on the letter tucked safe against her chest, as though its words could shield her from their stares. She made her way to the bench near the pump, the one mentioned in Gideon's letter. She sat with care, smoothing her skirt and resting her carpet bag at her feet. The bench creaked beneath her, but held. She folded her hands and waited. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine sap, horse sweat, and something else, expectation. The minutes stretched long. The sun dipped lower. Lamps were lit in windows. The chatter around her grew tired and then curious. Still no one came. A soft cough interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Walker?" The voice was worn but warm, like wool in winter. Margaret turned to see a woman in her later years, dressed in simple gray, her silver-streaked hair pulled back into a braid thick as rope. Her eyes were steady, her mouth neither kind nor cruel. "Name's Ruth Bell," the woman said. "Midwife. I help where I can. Man you're waitin' for, he won't be comin' down." Margaret blinked once. "You know him?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Most here don't, but I do. Used to bring his wife herbs, back before he stopped comin' into town. He don't take to strangers. Or surprises." Margaret felt the sting in her chest, but didn't let it show. "I see. There, Silson, do you?" Ruth asked gently. "Because this town sure don't. They see a woman different from the rest, and that's all they let themselves notice. But I see someone brave enough to come all this way, on faith alone." Margaret's throat tightened, but she nodded. "I've got a spare bed and warm stew," Ruth continued. "Ain't much, but it's something. You're not sleeping on this bench tonight." Margaret hesitated, glancing once more toward the silent edge of town, where the mountain road curled upward into the trees. The place where Gideon Black was supposed to meet her. The place he hadn't dared to come. "Thank you," she said softly. Ruth offered her arm. "Come on then, let 'em stare. You're stronger than they'll ever be." And as they walked through the narrowing street, the whispers faded into the night behind them, unable to follow where dignity led. The stew tasted of thyme and bone marrow, simple and rich, but Margaret barely touched it. She sat at Ruth Bell's kitchen table, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the candle flickering between them. Outside, the wind howled against the eaves, rattling the window panes like restless memories. The warmth of the little cottage did little to settle the chill inside her chest. Ruth poured another ladleful into her own bowl and took a bite before speaking. "Gideon Black ain't been in town since the year the Wilkes barn burned down. That was 6 winters ago, near enough." Margaret looked up. "He wrote me only 4 months ago." "He don't write often," Ruth replied. "And when he does, it's usually to order salt or canvas or bullets. Never a bride." She eyed Margaret carefully, not with judgment, but with something that resembled reluctant admiration. "You sure you want to go up there? That pass is steep, and the snow's still thick in the ravines." "I came all this way," Margaret said, her voice steady but quiet. "I answered his letter. I was promised a place. I intend to keep my end of it." Ruth's spoon stilled against the rim of her bowl. "You know what kind of man he is?" Margaret shook her head. "I know what kind of man he might be." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "He was once good, had a wife, a little girl too. Folks say the fever took him, others say it was a fire. I say it was both. Loss like that sets a man ablaze inside. Sometimes it burns out the good, sometimes it just hides it." Margaret touched the front of her bodice, where the letter lay pressed against her skin like a second heart. Then maybe he just needs reminding of who he was, of what kindness feels like. Ruth studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got more courage than any soldier I've ever seen." She stood and disappeared into the back room, returning with a woolen cloak, a wrapped loaf of bread, and a flask of cider. There's a man with a mule cart that hauls firewood up the trail. I'll have him take you to the foot of the pass. After that, it's your legs and your will." "I'll manage," Margaret said. The next morning, with frost still clinging to the grass and the town not yet stirring, Margaret climbed into the rickety cart beside a man who smelled of smoke and said nothing. They rumbled out of Coldwater Gap, past shuttered windows and crooked fences, until the town disappeared behind the trees like a forgotten sigh. At the base of the mountain trail, the man stopped without a word and pointed upward. The path twisted between pines, narrow and uneven. A raven called overhead, and the sky had that heavy look of snow yet to fall. Margaret stepped down, gathered her skirts, and slung her bag over one shoulder. She didn't look back. Her heart beat not with fear, but resolve. She wasn't going up there to be loved. She was going to be true, and whatever met her on that mountain silence, scorn, or salvation, she would meet it with both feet planted and her chin held high. The wind stiffened as Margaret climbed higher, whipping her skirt against her legs and numbing her cheeks with every step. The trail narrowed into a stony ribbon, winding between cliffs crusted with ice and fir trees bent low under the weight of late winter snow. Her breath came in sharp clouds, her boots soaked through, but she did not falter. Somewhere beyond the next rise, her new life waited or didn't. She meant to face it either way. When she reached the clearing, it appeared suddenly, as if carved out of the wilderness by a hidden hand. There stood the cabin, small, stout, and made of hand-hewn logs darkened by years of storm. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin line, almost hesitant, like even the fire inside had grown used to loneliness. She stepped forward and knocked twice on the wooden door. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness, swallowed by the snow-laden trees. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then came the creak of a boot against the floorboards, the sound of a latch turning, and the door opened just enough to reveal him. Gideon Black. He was broader than she'd imagined, with a beard streaked in gray and eyes like iron caught in shadow. He looked at her the way a man might look at an approaching storm, unwelcome, but too powerful to ignore. "You're early," he said flatly. Margaret took a slow breath. "Today's March 3rd. He looked down the path behind her. "Where's your husband?" "I came alone," she replied. "I'm the one who answered your letter." His brow furrowed. For a beat the wind moaned around them, filling the space where his words failed. Then he stepped back just enough to let her see the fire burning inside, the only warm thing for miles. "You're not what I expected," he muttered. "I imagine I'm not," she said, lifting her chin. They stood in that silence, her carrying the weight of his stare, him grappling with something unspoken. Then, without ceremony, he turned and walked inside. The door remained open. She followed. The interior was sparse. A table with one chair, a hearth with a pot hanging over the flames, shelves lined with tools and jars, a single cot in the corner, half covered in a bearskin. It smelled of pine, ash, and something human, but clean. Gideon stood near the fire, arms crossed. "You'll have the cot," he said. "I'll sleep on the floor." "I didn't come to displace you," she said. "I didn't send for someone like you." His voice wasn't cruel, only stunned. "Plain," I wrote. "Not, I know what you wrote," she said. "And I came anyway." He rubbed a hand down his face and let out a tired breath. "Storm's coming. You'll stay the night." Outside, snow had already begun to fall quiet, thick, and final. Margaret lowered her carpetbag gently to the floor, removed her cloak, and moved to the fire without asking. She sat, hands extended toward the warmth, not as a guest, not as a trespasser, but as someone who belonged where fate had brought her. Gideon watched her from the shadows of his own home, a man unmoored by the arrival of someone who didn't flinch or beg or flatter. Just sat calm and still, like a woman used to being underestimated. The wind howled louder, rattling the shutters. The blizzard had arrived. Neither of them spoke. The fire cracked, and in that flickering silence, the cabin settled around them both, two strangers, bound not by love or desire, but something far more fragile and far harder to name. The snow came hard and fast, blanketing the mountain in a white silence that swallowed the world beyond the cabin walls. For 3 days it fell without pause, sealing the pass and any notion of leaving. Margaret rose each morning before the gray light touched the frost-glazed window panes, tying her hair back with care and stoking the fire before Gideon had stirred from his bedroll near the hearth. She moved with quiet purpose, sweeping ashes, boiling water, hanging her wet clothes with deliberate modesty. She said little, but her hands spoke clearly. "I will not be idle. I will not be a burden." Gideon kept to his corner, his movements slow and wary, like a man sharing space with a ghost. He watched her when she wasn't looking, jaw clenched, fingers twitching as though resisting some impulse he couldn't name. He wasn't used to company, let alone a woman whose presence did not beg for his attention or bend itself to fit his moods. She simply was, large and calm and quietly steady, like a boulder dropped in the middle of a stream, unmoving, unbothered by the current around her. On the second morning, Margaret found a jar of oats in the cupboard and cooked a simple porridge, adding dried apple slices she found bundled in cloth. She placed a bowl near the fire where Gideon sat sharpening a hatchet. He didn't thank her, but he ate every bite. That afternoon, she took needle and thread to the rip in the cabin's only curtain. Her stitching was strong, not delicate, but it held. Gideon, watching from behind his book, said nothing. That night, she boiled snow for water and cleaned the hearth until the stones gleamed beneath the soot. He didn't understand her, didn't understand why her silence unsettled him more than any shouting match might have. She didn't ask why he hadn't come to the station. She didn't demand to know his past or weep over his indifference. She moved through the cabin like she'd been born to endure disappointment and had grown too tired to explain herself. And yet, the silence she brought was different from the one he'd lived in for years. His silence was hollow, echoing with memory. Hers was solid, anchored in intention, not retreat. She hummed once as she washed dishes, a sound so soft he thought at first it was the wind. A hymn, maybe, or something she made up to keep her heart company. That night, while the snow pressed against the door and the wind howled down from the ridge, Gideon sat on his stool by the fire, eyes fixed on her as she patched a tear in her sleeve. Her fingers moved steadily, and her brow was knit in concentration. There was something oddly graceful in the way she worked, not dainty, not delicate, but deliberate and full of care. He didn't know why the sight of her mending cloth stirred something in him. Maybe it was because no one had mended anything in this place since his wife had passed. Maybe it was the quiet way she restored things without asking to be seen. She looked up once and caught his gaze. Neither of them spoke. She did not smile. Neither did he. But she nodded slightly, as if to say, "I see you." And he looked away too quickly, ashamed of how much that small gesture had struck him. The snow didn't stop that night, but neither did the strange thaw inside him, the one he did not yet welcome, but could no longer deny. The blizzard eased on the fourth morning, but the snow lingered, thick and heavy along the ridge, as though the mountain had drawn a blanket over itself and gone back to sleep. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had settled into something resembling peace, though it was built on fragile silence. Gideon kept to his work, chopping wood, oiling tools, repairing the roof beam that groaned under the snow's weight. Margaret kept to hers, washing, cooking, tidying, and moving through the space with a kind of gentle reverence. She never rearranged anything that wasn't broken, never asked for more than was offered, and she never spoke of the locked trunk beneath his bed. She'd found it 2 nights before, while sweeping under the cot, its iron latch worn smooth with time and use. She hadn't tried to open it. Instead, she sat back on her heels and studied it in the dim firelight. There were scratches across the top, as though something had once been carved there, names, perhaps, or initials now too faded to read. When Gideon entered a moment later, snow dusted across his shoulders and beard, she simply stood and continued sweeping. He never mentioned the trunk, and she didn't ask. But that night, she heard him. The cry broke through the stillness sometime after midnight. Guttural, raw, not like a word, but something older, a sound from deep inside a man who'd carried his grief too long. She sat up in her cot, heart thudding. The fire had burned low, casting faint shadows across the cabin. Gideon was curled near the hearth, fists clenched, face twisted in pain even in sleep. He murmured a name, maybe 2. A girl's voice echoed in the room, or maybe it was just the wind in the chimney. Margaret lay back down and closed her eyes. She did not speak of it in the morning. Instead, she began drawing. She found a small book tucked in the bottom of her bag, one she used years ago when the world was too cruel and her words too heavy. With the stub of a pencil, she began sketching creatures she saw from the window, snow hares darting between the trees, a red fox stalking along the ridge, a crow perched on the woodpile, head tilted like it knew secrets it wouldn't share. Her lines were soft and sure, each page a prayer of quiet observation. She drew the cabin too, its roof bowed under snow, smoke rising like a whisper. In these pages, she found a kind of peace the world never offered her face to face. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the cabin dog, a brindled mutt with a limp and cloudy eyes, hobbled over to her where she sat on the step, drawing the outline of a pine tree. The dog dropped its head in her lap. She scratched behind its ears without looking up. It gave a contented sigh and curled at her feet. From across the yard, Gideon paused in splitting kindling. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in some other emotion he couldn't name. That dog had never taken to strangers. Not since before. He watched as Margaret murmured something soft to the old hound, rubbing its shoulder with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. She didn't notice him watching, or if she did, she gave no sign. That night, as he added a log to the fire and she sat stitching by the lamplight, the dog lay between them, belly full, tail twitching in a dream. Gideon glanced at Margaret, her face calm, brow smooth in concentration. For a moment, just a brief and dangerous one, he imagined what it would be like if she stayed. Not out of duty, not because of a letter or an arrangement, but because she wanted to. Then, he caught himself and turned away, ashamed of the warmth blooming in his chest. Outside, snow fell again, soft, silent, inevitable. The days stretched into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both accepted in silence. The storm outside had long since eased, but neither mentioned leaving. Gideon repaired the fence line, checked the snare traps, and hauled buckets of snow to melt for water. Margaret kept the hearth warm, the meals hot, and the corners of the cabin from slipping into disrepair. There was no conversation to fill the hours, but the stillness between them had shifted, softened into something less brittle. Like ice touched by the first breath of spring, it no longer cut when it cracked. One morning, as he reached for his coat hanging near the door, Gideon paused, brow furrowing. He held it up, fingers tracing the seam beneath the right sleeve, where the tear had been. The rough wool had been mended with tight, even stitches, almost invisible to the eye. He glanced at Margaret, who was kneading dough at the table, her hands dusted in flour. "You fixed it," he said, voice rough with disuse. She didn't look up, seemed ashamed to let a good coat fall apart over one ripped seam. He didn't reply, but something in his expression shifted, less guarded, more thoughtful. That night, when the scent of baking filled the cabin, he recognized it before the loaf even left the hearth oven. Sourdough. Just the way he liked it. Crust browned, the smell tangy and warm, dusted lightly with cornmeal. He sat across from her at the table, watched her slice the bread, steam rising from the center like a prayer. "How'd you know?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. She placed a slice on his plate. "You keep your vinegar starter in the cupboard. Hadn't been fed in a while, but it was still alive. Figured a man who keeps starter must have a taste for sourdough." He blinked once, surprised. "My wife used to bake it." Margaret said nothing, but the pause she gave was full of listening. Gideon picked up the bread, stared at it a moment, then took a bite. The crust crackled just right. He chewed slowly, swallowed. "Her name was Anna. And our daughter Lark. She had hair the color of fireweed and a laugh that could scare off crows." The candlelight flickered against the rough cabin walls. Margaret didn't speak, only looked at him with quiet attention, her hands resting still atop the table. "They died in a fire," he said, voice flat and low. 3 years ago, I was out setting trap lines. Came back to smoke and nothing else. Cabin gone. Them too." He swallowed hard, staring at the bread in his hands. Couldn't bury what wasn't left. Margaret's gaze dropped to her lap, and for a long moment there was no sound but the wind brushing against the window pane. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Not in pity, not in hollow comfort, just truth. Gideon looked at her then, really looked. There was no judgment in her eyes, no cloying sympathy, only understanding, born of her own unnamed wounds. He reached for another slice of bread. They sat in the glow of firelight and candle wax. The dog curled between them, the snow muffling the world outside. No more words were needed that night, but something had shifted, undeniably. Not forgiveness, not healing, not yet, but the first stones of a bridge being laid between two distant, weathered shores. The snow had begun to melt in quiet patches along the south-facing slope, and the cold that once bit through the cabin walls now lingered only in the mornings. Inside, the fire still burned, though more for comfort than necessity. Gideon sat near the hearth, carving the handle of a broken spade, his knife moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Margaret sat by the window with her journal, not sketching this time, but staring out at the glistening pines, the light dancing off the wet bark like glass. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer cautious or strained, but something gentler, like a quilt laid over an aching body, not to cure, but to comfort. It was in that silence that Margaret stood and walked to the table. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the letter. The same letter she'd read 100 times, its folds soft as cloth now, its corners worn from fingers, searching for meaning. She placed it on the table between them. "You wrote this," she said, her voice low. "It came to the agency in February. I was told you were looking for a woman who could work, who didn't ask for much, who wouldn't be frightened by the wild. You said you preferred someone plain." Gideon didn't speak, but his carving stopped. "I read this letter," she continued, "and for the first time, I didn't feel laughed at." Her eyes met his. "I've spent most of my life being a joke to someone. Too big for the pews, too soft for the dance floor, too quiet to fight back. I've been called things a woman shouldn't be called in public, laughed at in church, pitied at weddings." She sat across from him, hands folded over each other to hide their trembling. "I never expected to be loved, but I wanted safety, a place where I didn't have to apologize just for taking up space." She nodded toward the letter. "This what you wrote, it sounded like someone who knew what it meant to be alone, to want peace more than praise." Gideon leaned back slightly, his eyes on the letter as if seeing it for the first time. The words he'd written had come from a place of bitter practicality, not poetry. He'd meant what he said, but he hadn't imagined the weight those words might carry when they reached someone like her. "You didn't lie," Margaret said softly. "You said what you needed, and I came, not because I thought I'd be wanted, but because, in your words, I saw something I needed too." He looked at her then, really looked. Not at her size, or the slope of her shoulders, or the way her dress stretched at the seams, but at the woman who had walked into a town that mocked her, into a cabin that hadn't been cleaned in years, into a heart so shuddered it barely remembered how to beat. "I never thought anyone would answer that letter," he said finally. "I did," she replied, "and I'd do it again." The fire crackled softly. The dog stirred at Gideon's feet but didn't rise. The letter lay between them, no longer just ink and paper, but a thread connecting two lives that had spent too long in the dark. For the first time, Gideon didn't see Margaret as someone unexpected. He saw her as someone earned. The snow melted like a slow surrender, dripping from the eaves and running down the slope in narrow rivulets. The earth beneath it exhaled at last, damp and black and full of hidden life. Buds emerged along the spindly branches near the cabin, and small shoots of green pushed their way through the thawing ground with the quiet insistence of the forgotten. Margaret knelt in the soft earth behind the cabin, her skirts tucked under her knees, hands deep in soil, as she mapped out the first square of what would become their garden. Gideon stood nearby with a spade, watching her draw shallow lines in the dirt with her finger, marking where beans would go, where carrots might take root. She spoke as she worked, not constantly, but with a light rhythm, naming plants, recalling harvests from her childhood, laughing once at a memory of a chicken that used to steal green tomatoes from her mother's basket. Gideon didn't say much, but he listened, really listened. The silence between them had become something entirely new, something alive. In it were glances held just a moment longer, words spoken without defensiveness, the kind of pauses that held peace rather than tension. That afternoon, Gideon disappeared into the shed. Margaret assumed he was working on the tool handles he'd been fixing, but when he emerged near dusk, he was carrying a chair. Not one of the old, cracked things that leaned by the fire, but something new, fresh pine, sanded smooth, with a wide seat, and arms built sturdy enough to hold a body like hers without strain. It wasn't fancy, but it was careful. Each nail placed with thought, each joint fitted with quiet pride. For the porch, he said, setting it down beside the door. Margaret ran her fingers along the backrest, tracing the simple carved flowers he'd shaped there. "You built this?" He gave a small shrug. "Seemed you deserved to sit in something that didn't squeak like it was dying." She smiled, broad and full, and for the first time, he chuckled. A short, rough sound that surprised them both. She laughed in return, light, genuine. He shook his head, rubbing at his beard, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Days passed, soft and warm. On the morning of her birthday, though she hadn't spoken of it, she found him waiting near the edge of the clearing. He led her to a tree just beyond the garden's reach. There, carved into the bark in careful script, was her name, Margaret. Below it, a small heart, nothing more. She touched it, as if afraid it might vanish. "How did you know?" "I listen," he said, "even when I don't speak." She looked at him then, not as the man who hadn't come to the station, not as the recluse who once saw her as a burden, but as someone who had begun, piece by piece, to make space for her. But just as the warmth between them settled into stillness, a noise echoed from the woods, hooves on stone, fast and clumsy, a rider approaching from the east trail, where the snow had only recently cleared. The dog barked once, low and uncertain. Gideon's eyes narrowed as the rider came into view, a man in a long coat, face unfamiliar but posture aggressive, reins tight in his fists. Margaret stood behind Gideon, her heart quickening. The season had changed, yes, but some storms come without clouds. The horse was lathered and trembling by the time it clattered into the Coldwater Gap livery yard, its rider already shouting for the sheriff before his boots even hit the ground. Elmer Cotts, tall, red-faced, and reeking of sweat and whiskey, strode across the muddy main street with the swagger of a man convinced the law bent in his direction. He carried a rolled sheaf of papers in one hand and a slick smile in the other. The town hadn't seen Margaret Walker in weeks, not since she'd taken the pass to find her mountain man. Rumors had filled the silence. Some whispered she'd been turned away and had gone east again, others that she'd vanished into the snow like so many who wandered too far from warmth. But Elmer brought his own version of the truth, and he shouted it at every storefront. "She's my blood," he declared, slapping the papers on the sheriff's desk, "and she ain't right in the head. Signed her away under care of the family. Only reason she went west was 'cause she's not fit to tend to herself. These here say I got authority to bring her back." Sheriff Hammond scratched at his stubble, eyes squinting at the faded ink and wax seal. "These look strange," he muttered, but Elmer leaned in, voice dropping to a conspirator's drawl. "Judge in Richmond signed 'em. You know how them Eastern folks are, fussy but official. I just need help getting her down. Won't cause no trouble." "Wouldn't want it," said Coldwater Gap was harboring a fugitive. He grinned, showing teeth. But the papers weren't the only reason Elmer had come. He'd stopped the day before in the neighboring town of Granger's Point, where he'd met a man more ambitious than moral Amos Finch, the land baron overseeing the proposed rail expansion through the upper pass. Finch had long coveted Gideon Black's land, secluded, elevated, and sitting directly in the way of the planned route, but Gideon hadn't responded to offers nor threats. He lived beyond the town's reach, and that made him dangerous. Until now. "Elmer," Finch had said, twirling his gold watch chain, "you bring me that woman, and I'll make sure her guardian, this Gideon fellow, comes down from his little kingdom. We'll force him to speak, one way or another. Man like that's probably squatting anyway. And if he's harboring a ward unlawfully, well, that gives us more than leverage. It gives us law." So Elmer, who never cared for Margaret beyond the trouble she was worth, now found himself backed by money and menace. He swaggered through the saloon that night like a man who'd already won, buying drinks and whispering lies into willing ears. "Poor thing's not right," he told anyone who'd listen. "Didn't know what she was doing, going off into the hills with that lunatic. We're just trying to bring her home safe, for her own good. Few questioned him. Fewer still challenged Finch, whose pockets ran deep into the town's businesses. And by morning, word had spread like fire through dry grass. Margaret Walker wasn't safe. She was being hunted under paper and gold, and Gideon Black's quiet mountain life was about to be pulled into the ugly light of greed. Smoke hadn't yet touched the pines near the cabin, but the scent of it drifted on the wind. Something was coming, something far colder than winter. The knock came just after dawn, sharp and certain. Margaret was ladling warm water from the kettle when the sound struck the cabin door like the butt of a rifle. Gideon stood instantly, his hand going to the axe by the hearth without thought. The dog growled low, hackles rising. Gideon opened the door to find 3 men standing just beyond the porch. Sheriff Hammond, pale and uncomfortable, shifted from boot to boot like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Beside him stood Elmer, smug as ever, holding that same rolled set of papers in his meaty fist. And behind them, Amos Finch, dressed too fine for the mountain chill, coat trimmed in velvet, boots polished like glass, and a sneer thin as wire stretched across his face. "Gideon Black," the sheriff began, clearing his throat. "We're here on official matter. This here man, Mr. Kotz, has brought legal documentation from Virginia, claims he's got guardianship over Miss Walker, and intends to bring her home. This is 8 in the Grace. She ain't going anywhere," Gideon said flatly, his voice steady, his shoulders squared. Elmer stepped forward, lifting the papers like they were holy writ. "She's blood, see? And she's not in her right mind. Always been simple. You think she made the decision to come up here herself? This whole marriage nonsense, she ain't fit to choose. Now, I'm here to correct what the agency clearly botched. Signed authority and all. She belongs to me now." From behind Gideon, Margaret emerged slowly. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with something far older than fear. "I'm not your property, Elmer. You're my responsibility," he snapped. "And you've embarrassed the family long enough." Gideon stepped in front of her again, fists clenched. "You forged those papers. No court in Richmond gave you rights over a grown woman." Finch let out a low laugh. "Doesn't matter what you believe, Mr. Black. The documents carry a seal, and the sheriff here," he gave Hammond a nudge, "is obligated to acknowledge them." Gideon turned his eyes to Hammond. "You know this ain't right. You know it." Hammond looked down, avoiding both their stares. "I'm no judge. I'm just here to keep peace. They've got paper, Gideon. You stand in their way, and I'll be forced to arrest you for obstruction, possibly kidnapping." Tang. Margaret stepped forward then, placing a firm hand on Gideon's arm. "I won't let them take you," she said softly. "You're not the one in danger," he growled. "I am," she replied, louder now. "But if you fight them, they'll twist the law until it breaks you too, and I won't have that on my soul." And cast her dot now. Her voice cracked only once, but it was enough to make Gideon pause. She turned to Elmer. "I'll go, but only to stop you from dragging him through hell." Gideon looked at her as if the ground beneath him had tilted. "Don't. I have to," she said. "Just for now." Finch smiled, sharp and thin. Wise choice. But as Margaret stepped off the porch and toward the sheriff's waiting wagon, the wind picked up, cold and biting. The birds had gone silent. And though Gideon said nothing, the fire in his eyes promised this was not how the story would end. Ruth Bell stood on the church steps as the sun broke over the ridge, her shawl drawn tight against the morning chill. The frost had come back in the night, clinging to the rooftops like the stubborn residue of injustice. The town was already stirring smoke rising from chimneys, the clatter of buckets at the well, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there yesterday. Word had spread fast. Margaret Walker had been taken, hauled off like a criminal by her cousin, and a man whose money turned crooked wheels behind closed doors. Ruth's lips were pressed thin as she watched Mrs. Kellen pass with her youngest in tow. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "You heard what happened?" Mrs. Kellen paused, shifting her child on her hip. "I heard that woman was never right in the head. Some say she ran off without thinking. Others say she tricked that mountain man into—" "No," Ruth said, firmly enough that the child blinked. "She didn't trick anyone. She climbed that pass in winter, cooked meals, sewed clothes, mended that man's broken coat and his broken heart. You don't do that with madness. You do it with strength. Mrs. Kellen frowned. But those men had papers. And when did we start believing men with papers over what we've seen with our own eyes? Ruth snapped. You've seen Margaret. You saw her when she came in with her head held high, even as the town laughed behind her back. Did she ever ask for pity? For favors? No, she just did the work. And now they say she belongs to someone? Like property? More women gathered Mrs. Derry from the bakery, her flower-streaked apron still tied. Abigail Rowe, who taught Sunday school. Even shy Alice Green, who hadn't spoken in a town meeting in years. They formed in clusters, murmuring, listening as Ruth told them the truth. She baked bread for that man before he could even thank her, Ruth said. Sat through a storm without complaint. I've seen her calm that half-wild dog of his with a whisper. That woman came here with nothing and gave more than most of us ever have. And the sheriff just let them take her? Abigail asked. He didn't stop them, Ruth said. But that doesn't mean we can't. By midday, the crowd had grown. Men began to notice their wives not at the wash, not at the store, not at home. Ruth led them to the chapel, where Reverend Thorne waited in his black coat, brow furrowed with concern. I was told I should keep my sermons neutral, he began, his voice soft. But the Lord didn't give me a pulpit to stay silent when the innocent are dragged into darkness. He stepped down beside Ruth, his voice rising. Gideon Black may be rough of speech, and Margaret Walker may not fit the mold this town's used to, but I'll tell you now, if Coldwater Gap has a soul left in it, it stands with them, not with the liars who carry gold and forged ink. We've nodded to 7 ever, 2 Upson and ND2, and that would not that 9. The crowd erupted in quiet approval nods, murmurs, clenched jaws. Outside, the sky was darkening again, clouds rolling down the mountains with the weight of judgment. The storm that was gathering wasn't wind or snow, it was the town itself no longer watching, but waking. The old shaving mirror hadn't been used in years. Its silver backing was chipped, and the glass bore the cloudy haze of time, but it showed enough. Gideon Black dragged the blade down his jaw in slow, sure strokes, cutting through the tangled beard that had hidden his face like a wall. Each pass revealed something older than the years, cheekbones etched by grief, a mouth unused to smiling, eyes that had forgotten how to hope and were only just remembering. When he was done, he rinsed his hands in the basin, dried them on a linen towel Margaret had stitched, and buttoned the black coat hanging by the door. He saddled his horse in silence, the leather creaking beneath his gloves. Snowmelt dripped from the trees around the cabin, the sound like soft applause for a man who had finally stood up from the grave he'd dug for himself. He didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye. He only looked once at the garden bed where Margaret had planted her first seedlings before the trouble began. Then he mounted and rode into the wind. Coldwater Gap was quieter than usual when he arrived. Folks paused mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought, and watched as the man they called the Mountain Ghost rode down Main Street like a storm on legs. The black horse kicked up mud with every step, and Gideon didn't flinch beneath the stairs. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, dismounted, and walked through the door without knocking. Sheriff Hammond looked up from his desk, startled. "Gideon, I want a hearing," Gideon said. His voice was gravel, but it carried. "You what?" "A proper one. Before the preacher, before the people. You let those men take her on forged words and filthy gold. Now you're going to let the town hear the truth." Hammond swallowed hard. "Finch, he's still here. And Elmer's got—" "Nothing," Gideon cut in. "Nothing that holds up under daylight. I want the hearing. You owe her that." The door opened behind him. Ruth stepped in, followed by Reverend Thorne and a dozen townsfolk women, men, even children peeking from behind skirts. Word had spread. "You'll have your hearing," Ruth said. "We've cleared the chapel, and the preacher's ready." Gideon nodded once, then turned as the sheriff stammered and scribbled. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd, her eyes wide, face pale. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come. They'll twist everything. They'll ruin you to get to me." He looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, like she was the center of the world. "I ain't doing it for you," he said quietly. "I'm doing it for who I become with you." She blinked, tears catching the light. "You don't owe me. I owe myself," he said. "And maybe I owe the girl who came up that pass in a blizzard and never asked for a single thing." The chapel bell rang once, high and sharp. It was time. The chapel, used more for weddings and funerals than reckonings, had never been so full. Every pew groaned under the weight of townsfolk, and every rafter seemed to hold its breath. Lamplight flickered from wall sconces, casting long shadows across faces lined with suspicion, curiosity, and something more honest shame. At the front, Reverend Thorne stood behind the pulpit, not in his vestments but in plain clothes, the Bible resting beside a stack of documents and a single worn journal. Ruth Bell stood to one side, firm and still, while Sheriff Hammond hovered nervously, fingers fidgeting with the brim of his hat. Gideon and Margaret sat side by side at the long table, facing Elmer Cotts and Amos Finch. Finch looked smug, polished in his fine coat, while Elmer leaned back in his chair like he already owned the outcome. Between them lay the folded papers they had shoved into the sheriff's hands not 2 days before legal declarations, so they claimed, proving Elmer's right to take Margaret and Finch's supposed interest in Gideon's land. Reverend Thorne raised his hand. "This hearing is not a court of law, but it is a court of conscience. We are here to discern truth, and truth alone, in the eyes of God and community." Finch stood first, laying his hand on the documents. "The law is clear. This man, Gideon Black, harbored a woman under false pretenses. This woman, Miss Walker, was promised elsewhere, under family guardianship. Mr. Cotts has provided papers, sealed and signed." He nodded to Elmer, who stood and puffed out his chest. "She's never been right, always too soft in the head. She was set to be placed in care, and instead she ran off to hide in the mountains. I came to collect her, legally." Margaret didn't speak at first. Instead, she reached for her journal, its cover worn and the pages stiff from handling. She opened it gently, revealing more than sketches this time. On one page, a careful drawing of a floor plan, a crude room lined with beds and a bar. On another, a hand-drawn map of their hometown, with an alley marked in red. Beneath it, written in small, steady letters, "Elmer said I was too big to marry, but the men behind Madam's parlor wouldn't care. He said they'd pay better for women who didn't speak up." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reverend Thorne's eyes widened. Finch stiffened. Elmer flushed dark red. "She drew this the night he made that offer," Ruth said, stepping forward. "Didn't tell a soul until now, because she was ashamed of his cruelty." Margaret met Elmer's stare. "You don't want me back to protect me. You want to control what I might say. You thought no one would believe a woman like me." Then Ruth laid a single yellowed parchment on the table. "As for the land," she said, turning to the townsfolk, "I found this in the old records from when I used to tend to Gideon's wife. It's a deed signed by Judge Mallory himself. It grants the Black family their land in perpetuity in exchange for services during the war. Ain't a man alive who can take it now." Finch reached for the paper, but the sheriff slapped his hand away. "That's a lawful deed." The chapel erupted, some shouting in outrage, others murmuring apologies. Women wept quietly. Men bowed their heads. Gideon took Margaret's hand beneath the table, rough fingers closing around hers. Truth had found its voice, and neither money nor forged ink could silence it now. The chapel doors burst open with a gust of spring wind, snapping hymn pages loose from the pulpit Bible and sending startled murmurs through the room. A tall man stepped inside, boots heavy with travel, a tin star glinting against his chest. His coat was dusted with trail grit, his face hard with purpose. "I'm looking for Elmer Cotts," the man said, voice sharp as a blade. "And Amos Finch." The room stilled. Elmer rose slowly, eyes darting toward the rear exit like a hound sniffing for escape. "Who's askin'?" he muttered, hand twitching toward the papers he'd brought like a shield. The man stepped forward, drawing a folded parchment from inside his coat. "Marshal Julian Rafe, acting on orders from the Federal District Court in Roanoke. I have a warrant for the arrest of Elmer Cotts on charges of forgery, fraud, and attempted trafficking across state lines, and an injunction against Amos Finch for conspiracy to defraud private landholders for the benefit of an unapproved rail expansion." A collective gasp swept through the crowd like a spark catching dry straw. The preacher looked to Ruth, who stood tall near the pulpit, arms folded, eyes fierce with satisfaction. "I sent word last week," she said quietly, "just in case." Elmer lunged for the door, knocking over a pew and scattering hymnals in his path, but Marshal Rafe was faster. With practiced precision, he spun the man around and clapped irons on his wrists. "That's enough," he growled. "You're not laying hands on anyone else. Not today, not ever. They were favet in the morning to the coses." Margaret sat motionless at the table, her journal still open before her, while Gideon stood like stone behind her, hands curled into fists at his sides. Finch, who had not moved, now cleared his throat and stood, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Marshal, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. I was merely conducting business. You forged deeds, bribed clerks, and tried to steal land granted by war charter," the marshal interrupted. "You're not walking away from this." He nodded to a second deputy who entered behind him, and together they placed Finch under restraint, ignoring the man's sputtering objections. The sheriff, pale and sweating, looked from the arrests to the congregation, as if hoping someone would speak in his defense. No one did. Reverend Thorne finally spoke. "Sheriff Hammond, you allowed injustice to take root under your watch. You bowed to gold and ignored conscience. You have brought shame upon this town." The sheriff opened his mouth but closed it again. Then, wordlessly, he removed his badge and placed it on the preacher's table before slinking out the side door. For a moment, the silence held thick, holy. Then a voice from the back called out. "She stood tall when none of us did." Another followed. "She changed that man's heart. We all saw it. She brought him back to life," came a third. And suddenly, the room was rising, hands clapping, voices lifting. Margaret sat stunned, tears blurring her vision as the townspeople stood for her and for Gideon, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because they had seen the truth with their own eyes. Gideon reached down, his hand warm and calloused in hers. "You were always more than they saw," he whispered. "And you were always more than you believed," she replied. And for the first time, they didn't feel like outcasts. They felt like home. The bells rang clear through the valley, their sound climbing the mountains like sunlight touching snow. It was the first time in years they'd rung for a wedding. Most times they tolled only for funerals or fire alarms. But today they sang for something else. Not just a marriage, but a mending, a binding of wounds that had long been left untended. Margaret stood in the back room of the chapel, the wooden floor beneath her feet covered in sprigs of pine and wild lilac, gathered that morning by the preacher's daughters. Her dress was soft blue, stitched by the hands of women who had once whispered behind her back, but now worked beside her. Ruth had overseen the seams herself, insisting on fine detail along the hem, little flowers embroidered in white thread like snowdrops blooming in spring. "You look radiant," Ruth said, fastening the last button at Margaret's neck, "and don't go thinking otherwise." Margaret turned toward the warped mirror leaning against the wall. The woman staring back at her was not dainty, not graceful in the usual way, but she was strong, still, rooted. The gown flowed over her curves with quiet dignity, and her hair, braided and pinned, gleamed like dark honey in the morning light. "They laughed at me," Margaret said softly. "Not long ago. They didn't understand what they were seeing," Ruth replied. "But they do now." In the chapel, the pews were filled with faces, young, old, once doubtful, now open. The baker had brought fresh loaves, shaped like hearts. Abigail Rowe and the Sunday school girls had placed candles along the window ledges, their flames steady as vows. Even the sheriff's old chair, empty now, had been dusted and left out of respect. Redemption, after all, wasn't just for the bride and groom. Gideon stood at the altar, his black coat pressed, his hair combed back, and his hands folded in front of him. He looked taller somehow, as though forgiveness had lengthened his spine. The congregation fell into hush as Margaret entered, every step measured, the wooden floor creaking beneath her like a hymn. Her eyes met his, and he smiled, not the guarded smile of a man uncertain of his place, but the smile of one who had found it. The preacher stepped forward, his voice warm as the sun spilling through the chapel windows. "Today we witness a joining not just of man and wife," he said, "but of broken pieces becoming whole. We've seen love take root where none expected, and grace rise where once there was only judgment. He looked at Margaret, then to the gathered town. The Lord don't care what size a soul is, just how much light it holds. And I tell you now, this woman shines so bright, you'd have to be blind not to feel it. Margaret blinked back tears as Gideon reached for her hands. I thought I needed solitude to heal, he said. Turns out, I needed you. They spoke their vows in voices clear and steady, not trembling with fear, but rich with conviction. And when the preacher declared them husband and wife, the bells rang again louder this time. Outside, the townspeople lined the chapel steps, tossing wildflower petals and humming old songs. Children ran ahead to the reception table, where pies and jam jars waited. Gideon held Margaret's hand the entire time, not as a man who had taken a bride, but as a man who had been saved by one. And Margaret, wrapped in her blue gown and sunlight, no longer felt like someone who had been chosen last. She felt like someone who had poured, changed the choosing. Spring had unfurled across the high pass like a patchwork quilt, violets pushing through thawed earth, bees tracing lazy loops around the cabin eaves, and the river running full and quick again, fed by melted snow and the stirrings of something long asleep. Margaret knelt in the soil beside the porch, her hands buried in loam, planting the first flowers she had ever chosen for herself. They were not showy blooms, no hothouse roses or imported lilies, just marigolds, blue flax, and lupine. Wild things, resilient things. The kind that bloomed not in manicured gardens but in stubborn, wind-beaten corners of the world. Like her, she pressed each seed into the soil gently, as though planting a prayer, and covered it with care. Inside the cabin, the clatter of tin cups and laughter echoed through the open windows. 2 children from the town, a boy missing a front tooth and a girl with twin braids, chased each other around the table, while Ruth read from a book, rocking slowly in the chair Gideon had built for Margaret. The old dog lay on the rug, tail thumping whenever someone stepped too close. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter or a fortress. It felt like a place that had exhaled and become home. Gideon stepped out onto the porch, a sack of feed slung over one shoulder, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He watched Margaret quietly for a moment, marveling still at the way she moved through the world, unhurried, grounded. She looked up at him and smiled, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. He returned it without thinking. You keep planting things, he said. Pretty soon we won't have a yard left. She leaned back on her heels, brushing her palms against her skirt. That's the plan. Down in the lower clearing, where once bramble and thistle had grown wild, now stood the beginnings of a schoolhouse, simple, sturdy, built with lumber and community hands. After the wedding, the town had asked if Gideon would permit it on his land, citing its central location and generous space. He'd agreed without hesitation, surprising even himself. The children came up on Fridays now, laughing their way up the trail, their lessons mixed with stories from Ruth, lessons from the preacher, and the occasional fable from Margaret's sketchbook. It was during these visits that Gideon found himself smiling the most, at muddy boots by the door, at half-eaten apples on the porch rail, at the sound of Margaret singing while she cooked for a crowd. He still chopped wood each morning, still repaired tools and checked traps, but now there was more purpose, more warmth, more noise, even. He didn't mind. But some evenings, when the light stretched long over the ridge and the wind came down soft from the pines, Gideon would walk alone to the tree near the edge of the clearing, the one where he had carved Margaret's name. Just beside it, faint and weather-worn, were 2 other names, Anna and Lark, his wife and daughter, his first life. He would sit there quietly, hat in his lap, not speaking, not crying, just remembering. The ache hadn't gone away. It never would. But it didn't haunt him like it once had. Now it rested beside gratitude, side by side like old friends. He'd return to the cabin when the lanterns were lit, the windows glowing with warmth, and the sound of Margaret's laughter curled through the air like the smoke from their chimney. He'd open the door, step inside, and feel for the first time in a long time that the past no longer held his future hostage. The garden in the pass had begun to bloom. The sun hung low over Coldwater Gap, its golden light pooling across the dusty street and warming the wooden beams of the chapel. Time had softened the town's sharp edges. New coats of paint covered old scars. Children's laughter rang louder than gossip now, and where once wagons clattered with suspicion, they now rolled with welcome. Ruth Bell, older now, her braids streaked silver and white, stood on the porch of her home near the edge of town. Her hands were clasped around a cup of mint tea, and beside her sat a young woman new to the valley, her face still marked with the wide-eyed wonder of the newly married. The girl was quiet, watching the mountain pass rise in the distance, its peaks touched with the last snow of spring. "They say no one can live up there long," the girl said. "Too cold, too far from the world." Ruth smiled, the lines around her eyes folding like the pages of a familiar book. "Funny," she said, "because that's where love took root. Not the easy kind, not the kind you find in poems or stories with lace. No, the kind that's slow and solid, that holds when everything else gives way." She sipped her tea, letting the memory settle between them. "Years back," Ruth continued, "a woman came off the train here. Big woman, quiet voice, shoulders squared like she carried all her years on her back. Margaret Walker. Most folks laughed when they saw her. Whispers and stares. They said she wasn't what a bride should look like." The young woman frowned. "That's cruel." "It was," Ruth said. "But she didn't break. She went right up that pass to meet a man she'd never seen, Gideon Black. Reclusive, grief-struck, a man the town feared more than they pitied. He'd buried his family in silence and didn't think he'd ever speak again. But she did something no one else could. She stayed. She cooked. She planted. She listened. And when the world tried to tear them apart, she stood taller than the mountains themselves." Ruth set down her cup and pointed toward the ridgeline, where green had begun to creep up through the thaw. "Up there, love changed a broken man, and a woman they all laughed at became the soul of this valley." The young woman was quiet for a long time. Then, with a soft voice, she asked, "Did they stay up there?" Ruth nodded. "They did. Built a life full of laughter, full of light, opened the land to children, to stories. There's a school up there now, right next to the garden she started. Some say you can still hear music from the porch when the wind turns just right. Knowing age, no tin." Later that evening, in the quiet of the old chapel, Ruth unlocked the drawer beneath the altar and pulled out a leather-bound journal, worn and soft from years of turning pages. Margaret's sketchbook. She opened it slowly. Inside were drawings of hares and foxes, children in bonnets, wildflowers blooming from stone, but also moments Gideon beside the hearth, hands carved with age, a pair of boots on the porch, a ring glinting in morning light. On the final page, beneath a delicate sketch of their cabin, framed by pine and stars, were the words, "Love doesn't always arrive in the shape we dream. Sometimes it climbs a mountain with a letter in its hand and a quiet heart that never stops hoping." The screen faded to black, the echo of bells distant but unmistakable. And so the story lived on.